All right, let's bring in now Sky News host Caleb Bond. Caleb, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure as always.
Look, what did you make of Michelle Bullock's comments today in a speech where she clearly indicated that wage growth is too high at 4% at the moment and it isn't consistent, this is how she put it, isn't consistent with getting inflation back on track?
Well, that 4% is a 14-year high, and I suppose it's not unsurprising that at a time of inflation, people would, of course, be seeking pay rises to deal with that inflation because the dollar in their hand is being devalued, and so they need extra money to pay for everything that's going up. But the problem is when the federal government does not, through its own policy measures, do anything itself to reduce inflation, you've only got one measure left, and that's to increase interest rates. And, you know, I've been critical of the RBA, as have many other people. But if the federal government doesn't pull its own weight, and the comments made by Bullock today were very similar to Philip Lowe when he was finishing up as Reserve Bank Governor, when he told the Senate that the growth in housing, the number of new houses being built, is roughly half the increased rate of migrants. So it's not hard to see what happens in that circumstance. And if the federal government doesn't cut its own spending, then someone else has to. And unfortunately, that ends up being the consumer via interest rates.
Yeah. I mean, it looks at the moment like the RBA's just using interest rates as the only lever to get inflation under control. We need both monetary and fiscal policy working together. It doesn't appear that that's happening. And the other point to make about the high immigration levels is that at the moment, you know, while it's keeping us out of recession, technically speaking, it is putting more pressure on the rental crisis, on the housing crisis, as we've been talking about. And that's a problem as well when it comes to inflation. So deliberately, you know, directly contributing to the issue of pushing rates up.
Well, it's like a dog chasing its own tail, because we always say, OK, we've got all these jobs we need to fill, so we bring in the migrants to fill the jobs. But bringing in the migrants necessitates more jobs because, of course, they need houses to live in, schools to send their kids to, supermarkets to go to. So you chase this sort of eternal growth that just goes on and on and on and on and on. You never actually plug the hole. And in the meantime, we find ourselves in a position where our quality of living is going down and our cost of living is going up.
And families are struggling even more, and our businesses too. Now, let's have a look at what's happened with this hijacking of the Israel cargo ship. Yemen's Houthi rebels have released footage of their military wing hijacking a cargo ship with Israel links in the Red Sea. They've taken 25 crew members hostage. Israel has said the ship is British-owned and Japanese-operated. They say that this hijack is an Iranian act of terror. I think we've got some footage to show you. I mean, Caleb, it looks like other terrorist groups are clearly taking advantage of the Hamas assault on Israel.
Of course, and I suppose you asked the question, why wouldn't they? Because they're all essentially in the same fight at the end of the day. They want the entirety of the Middle East, there's no doubt about that. But this is an extraordinary intervention because it has taken the war outside the bounds of Israel and Palestine and into international waters. And we haven't yet seen that. I mean, of course, we've seen protests and various other demonstrations around the world, but we haven't actually seen an act of war, an act of terror, taking, as we saw in that footage, the crew at gunpoint hostage and hoisting up Palestinian flags on that boat. They are showing they are serious. And this is not Hamas doing it, it's other groups as well. So if that continues, the escalation is extraordinary.
No, and we're already seeing it even on our streets, even if it's not terrorists. I mean, it's still anti-Semitism, it's global. Look, still on this topic, we're still hearing reports now from Palestinian journalists, also even from the White House. Joe Biden even indicated that he hoped a deal was about to happen
fingers crossed
between Israel and Hamas over the release of some of the Israeli Jewish hostages. I'm not sure from the reports that have emerged that it looks like such a good deal. You know, the reports that are coming out in the Palestinian media is that it would be 300 hostages released by Israel in return for 50 of the Israeli hostages released by Hamas. What do you think about this?
Well, I suppose what they're playing into is the fact that Israel has always put a high price on the heads of its people, right? And ultimately what they want to achieve is to get those hostages out of there. But you're talking about 50 of what, about 400 people who've been taken hostage by Hamas in exchange for
240.
Potentially...
It was actually 239, but one person had a baby, so now there's 240 hostages.
But we're talking about this potentially involving such things as a ceasefire or humanitarian pause, as they like to call it. You're at war with people who don't play by the rules. And I have no doubt that if you had a ceasefire, Israel may well adhere to that, but do we really expect Hamas would do so? It's a question of what are you willing to give up in order to get those hostages back? I fear that going down this road may actually lead to a longer war and potentially the hostages who are not released staying there even longer, rather than a strategy to get them all in one go.
Look, it's a very difficult scenario. I mean, you know, you do anything to get your child back if your parents separated and they're being held by terrorists. But you know what? It's a very difficult dilemma for the Israeli government and society, and let's see where it lands. Meanwhile, our government here, the Australian government, seeking advice on how, again, to be tougher on these you know, criminals that have been released in this detention scandal. What's the latest on what the government is now looking at? Well,
they're apparently seeking legal advice on whether or not they could pass laws to specifically detain people who have previously been jailed for crimes in Australia, which would be similar to terrorist laws, basically. I can't understand why they didn't have that ready to go when the decision of the High Court was dropped, because the decision of the High Court was that the government does not have the power to detain people under the Constitution. That's a decision that can be made by the courts, which very clearly opens the door to the government creating laws that allows the courts to detain those people, saying, OK, you're not a citizen, you were an asylum seeker, we've denied you asylum, but we either can't deport you or we don't want to deport you to a country where they're going to chop your head off. So we're going to detain you. And that's a decision that the court can make. It would seem pretty up and down straightforward, but we know the government didn't have that ready to go. We got the legislation instead that they put up last week that was then heavily amended by the opposition. Now they say they're looking at it. Well, it's a little bit late. These people are already on the streets.
Look, just finally, another big story today that it looks like the government's green dream is really struggling. Chris Bowen had forecast that by 2030, which is not that far away, 89% of all cars sold would be electric. But now, according to this report in The Australian today, it looks like only a third of cars by that time frame will be electric. Where does this leave Labor's green target, Caleb?
Well, in tatters. And they've basically already admitted. I mean, Jim Chalmers admitted about a month ago that it would be impossible to meet the current net zero targets that they have set. Many people in the energy sector, Kerry Schott, who is a director of AGL, has been very open about the fact that we won't be able to meet our net zero targets, and this was a major tenet of it. And we're not talking about a small window they've missed here. Going from 89%, nearly 90%, down to a third is going to be a major hit to their targets. But the government's answer to that is we need to go harder, and that's what Jim Chalmers said a month ago when he was talking about net zero targets, that if we can't meet what we've got in front of us at the moment, we need to impose it harder, this idea that we enforce renewable energy, etc. So if they want to achieve the 89% target, they'll have no choice but to do the same with electric cars. And the way to do that, as the ACT already has said they will do, is to mandate that only electric cars can be sold from a certain date. I think the ACT is 2035, so don't be surprised.
I mean, they can't do that unless the cost of electric vehicles comes down. The average Australian can't afford them, and the infrastructure's not there in any case to charge the vehicle.
No, it's utterly ridiculous, but they could, by the stroke of a pen, do it if they wanted to. The ACT's done it. If they did it at a federal level, I mean, they can do whatever they want, but it would be disastrous. I mean, Australia's a very big country. Can you imagine trying to drive from here across the Hay Plain, go across to Perth, Earth in an electric vehicle or working on a farm. I mean, we're going to have electric Land Cruisers or something.
Without being able to charge it, I know. Caleb Bond, thank you so much.